The room was too small for the humidity. Canvas walls sagged under the weight of monsoon air, trapping the smell of wet earth and diesel fumes that drifted in from the vehicle park outside. A single oscillating fan clicked uselessly against the heat, pushing around air thick enough to taste. On the folding table at the center of the room sat a stack of freshly delivered field manuals, American print, crisp binding, sharp black lettering stamped with institutional certainty. The Major did not sit. He stood with his sleeves rolled past the elbow, forearms browned by months under a Southeast Asian sun, eyes fixed on the top manual as though it were a live device. Around him, 2 captains and a signal sergeant waited in silence. Outside, somewhere beyond the wire, artillery thudded in slow, distant rhythm. The Americans called it shaping operations. Firepower before movement, volume before presence. The Major placed one hand on the manual. It was heavier than it looked. Hundreds of pages of diagrams, aerial insertion procedures, standard patrol formations, engagement protocols built around dominance of fire. The United States military had reduced war to geometry and tonnage. Movement by helicopter, search and destroy, secure by saturation. If contact was made, escalate immediately and overwhelm. On paper, it was flawless. On paper, it assumed you owned the sky. He flicked it open. The spine cracked cleanly. The ink still carried the dry chemical scent of mass production. Institutional authority pressed into pulp and glue. He read a passage aloud, not for comprehension, but for texture. Upon encountering hostile elements, immediate application of suppressive fire is recommended to achieve tactical superiority. He let the sentence hang. The captain nearest him shifted his weight. They had all trained alongside Americans. They had seen the scale columns of helicopters lifting like mechanical locusts, B-52 arcs carving invisible grids across jungle canopy. It was overwhelming, impressive, terrifying, and loud. The Major closed the book slowly. In the jungle north of Nui Dat, sound did not belong to you. It belonged to the insects, to the dripping canopy, to men who had lived their entire lives inside that green darkness. The Viet Cong and North Vietnamese army did not mass in open fields waiting to be suppressed. They dissolved. They listened. They bled you through time. He had walked that terrain. The ground swallowed doot prints by morning. Leech-infested streams cut movement to a crawl. Visibility dropped to 5 meters in bamboo thickets. The jungle did not reward noise. It punished it. He looked at the men in the room, not as subordinates, but as futures. Young officers who would soon step beyond cleared perimeters and into places where artillery could not see them. "If we follow this," he said quietly, tapping the manual, "we'll fight their war the American way." No one spoke. Because to reject American doctrine in 1960s Vietnam was not just tactical dissent. It was institutional heresy. The United States was the most powerful military force on Earth. Their air cavalry could move a battalion in minutes. Their logistics chains fed entire divisions across oceans. Australia's Special Air Service Regiment was smaller, lighter, almost invisible by comparison. The captain finally asked what everyone was thinking. "With respect, sir, are you suggesting we ignore it?" The Major's gaze drifted toward the tent flap, where humid jungle light seeped through like diluted blood. Beyond that thin canvas lay the Puok Tui province villages threaded with tunnels, enemy units that preferred patience over spectacle. American doctrine demanded contact. The jungle demanded absence. He picked up the manual again. For a moment, it seemed he might slide it back into the stack, compromise with it, annotate it perhaps. Instead, he struck a match. The sulfur flare was small but violent in the dim tent. The flame trembled as he held it to the corner of the page. Paper blackened, curled, then caught. The fire moved faster than expected, devouring paragraphs of confident instruction, diagrams of helicopter landing zones, bold headings about shock and awe. No one moved to stop him. The fan clicked uselessly as smoke twisted upward, carrying with it the smell of burning ink and binding glue. Bureaucratic scent turned acrid. The Major dropped the book into an empty ammunition tin and watched it burn down to warped, glowing fragments. It was not theater, It was a decision. "We don't announce ourselves," he said evenly. "We don't escalate unless we must. We patrol in fours, not platoons. We track, we observe, and when we strike, it's because we've chosen the ground." His voice never rose. That was the unsettling part. There was no anger in it, only calculation. The Americans believed dominance came from visibility and force concentration. The Australians were about to wager that survival and lethality came from becoming smaller than the jungle itself. Outside, a helicopter thundered overhead, rotors chopping the air with mechanical certainty. Inside the tent, the last of the manual collapsed into embers. The signal sergeant felt something he would not admit for years, a mix of dread and relief. Dread because rejecting the world's most powerful playbook meant stepping into uncertainty without a safety net. Relief because somewhere deep down he knew the major was right. In the weeks that followed, four-man patrols would slip beyond the wire without fanfare. No artillery curtain, no insertion spectacle, just men moving slowly enough to hear their own breath against the jungle. But in that moment, in that suffocating room, none of them could fully see where this decision would lead. Only this was clear: they had just chosen to fight a different war. And somewhere beyond the tree line, men who had spent their lives mastering silence were waiting to test whether that choice would save them or get them killed. The jungle did not care about ideology. It absorbed both armies the same way: sweat first, then noise, then certainty. From above, the American war in Vietnam looked like a scale-made manifest. Fire bases carved into ridge lines like concrete declarations of intent, sandbags stacked in geometric precision, artillery tubes angled toward unseen grids on laminated maps, helicopters lifting in disciplined waves, rotor wash flattening elephant grass into temporary submission. At night, the perimeter flared white under illumination rounds, machine guns test-firing into darkness, as if sound itself could enforce control. It was a system built on mastery through dominance. The institutional voice of American Special Operations Doctrine spoke in the language of tempo, reach, and overwhelming response. Insert fast, engage decisively, extract under air cover. Measure success in body counts and territory temporarily denied. Technology was not merely an advantage, it was an organizing principle. Radios stitched units together across valleys, gunships turned suspected movement into controlled destruction within minutes. Logistics flowed in steel arteries from coastal ports to inland fire bases. From the command tent, the war made sense. Colonel Harris, career officer, West Point graduate, meticulous in his field notes, stood over a plywood table one humid afternoon, pointing at a topographic overlay where enemy activity had spiked along a river corridor. His staff moved with confidence. If contact occurred, artillery could respond within 4 minutes, helicopter gunships within 7, a company-sized sweep would follow. Pressure applied, enemy displaced, zone cleared. It was systematic, it was rational, and in open terrain it worked. But the jungle was not open terrain. It was vertical, layered, and patient. The sound did not travel cleanly, visibility shrank to meters, radios crackled and died under canopy interference, maps aged poorly in monsoon cycles. The enemy did not hold ground, he flowed through it. 200 kilometers away, Captain Michael Mick Donnelly of the Australian SAS stood barefoot on damp soil before dawn, feeling the texture of leaf litter between his toes. He was not consulting a map, he was listening. The Australian patrol culture emerging in Vietnam had not been drafted in staff colleges. It had been shaped by Malayan counterinsurgency, by indigenous trackers, by a national military tradition that distrusted rigid hierarchy in favor of competence proven in dirt and silence. Donnelly had absorbed it in fragments, lessons about patience, about reading spoor older than the sun overhead, about understanding that jungle trails were conversations if you knew how to interpret them. Where the Americans built bases, the Australians built absences. A typical Australian patrol moved in 4-man elements, sometimes 6, no armored convoy, no artillery umbrella waiting to speak. Their radios were tools of last resort, not lifelines. Movement was deliberate, measured in hours rather than kilometers. They did not sweep, they stalked. The objective was not to displace the enemy with noise, but to understand his rhythm until a quiet ambush could fracture it. In American briefings, this looked like passivity. In Australian debriefs, it was described as patience. The contrast was not personal. It was architectural. American doctrine assumed that contact was inevitable and desirable. You sought it, shaped it, overwhelmed it. The enemy, forced into direct engagement, would break under superior firepower. Attrition became arithmetic. Australian doctrine assumed the opposite. Contact was a failure of invisibility. If you were seen before you chose to be, something had already gone wrong. Success meant moving through contested space without ever triggering the violent machinery the Americans relied upon. One afternoon, Donnelly was flown into an American firebase for coordination. The sound hit him first. Generators coughing diesel into humid air, radios layered with overlapping chatter. The metallic clang of ammunition crates is being shifted. Helicopters arriving in dusty crescendos. The place smelled of fuel and metal and damp canvas, a war industrialized. An American major greeted him with professional courtesy and thinly veiled skepticism. "We've got a battalion sweep scheduled through this sector," he explained, tapping a map. "We'll flush them south. You can pick up the remnants." Donnelly studied the grid lines. The plan was clean, logical. It also assumed the enemy would behave like a static target rather than a living intelligence. "If you announce yourself with a battalion," Donnelly replied evenly, "you won't flush them, you'll teach them." It wasn't arrogance, it was a different theory of violence. The Americans believed pressure created compliance. The Australians believed pressure created adaptation. In the jungle, adaptation wins. From the Viet Cong perspective, men barefoot in tunnel systems, memorizing the cadence of distant rotor blades, American operations were predictable in their intensity. The roar preceded the sweep. The artillery bracketed known choke points. The perimeter lights flared at night in ritualistic intervals. They learned the rhythms. They learned when to disappear and when to lay traps along likely withdrawal routes. The Australians disrupted rhythm by refusing to generate one. A patrol under Donnelly would lie motionless for hours beside a narrow track, mosquitoes feeding freely, muscles cramping, breath synchronized with insects. They studied the enemy's habits, how often a courier passed, how the weight of supplies altered footprints, how rain changed the depth of heel impressions. When they struck, it was brief and surgical. No extended firefight, no artillery correction. A snap of controlled violence, then disappearance before retaliation organized itself. To American planners, this seemed small, limited impact, but the metric was wrong. The Australians were not measuring territory held. They were measuring psychological pressure applied invisibly. Every trail could contain eyes. Every messenger could be tracked. The jungle itself became uncertain. In private, professional contempt simmered on both sides. American officers saw Australian methods as insufficiently aggressive, even timid. Australians saw American sweeps as loud declarations of insecurity machines compensating for misunderstanding. Yet both systems were built by experts. Both had internal logic. Colonel Harris once reviewed an after-action report from Donnelly's squadron. 4 enemy killed, documents captured. No friendly casualties, no air support requested. The engagement lasted under 90 seconds. He frowned, not in dismissal, but in discomfort. How do you scale that? The American machine was designed for multiplication, battalion times brigade, firepower times frequency. The Australian approach resisted scaling because it was built on individual judgment, on the patrol commander's ability to read terrain, on the tracker's instinct, on the discipline to wait longer than comfort allowed. It was not that one army was braver. It was that one trusted systems more than senses. And this is where the intellectual collision sharpened. The Americans asked for reports, metrics, and demonstrable control. The Australians offered fewer engagements, quieter successes, less visible impact. To those who measured war in tonnage and sortie counts, the Australian footprint seemed almost invisible. but invisibility was the point. The jungle magnified every difference. The American war sounded like engines and artillery, and shouted commands carried over radio nets. The Australian war sounded like insects and distant footfalls and breath held too long. Two armies, two philosophies, one enemy who understood both. And beneath the professional politeness, a question hung in the humid air. If overwhelming force was the correct answer, why did the jungle keep swallowing it? The Australians were willing to say the uncomfortable thing aloud, that the environment had veto power over doctrine. Those manuals written for Europe did not automatically translate to monsoon forests. That perhaps the war was not asking for more noise, but less. The first time they tried to prove it would not be in a briefing room. It would be in a stretch of jungle where an American sweep had just passed through loudly, and an Australian patrol chose to move in afterward, not to reinforce the assault, but to test whether the enemy had truly been dislodged. The result would force both sides to confront something deeper than tactics. It would force them to confront whether mastery in one war could become blindness in another. The patrol stepped off at 0311, long before the jungle admitted the possibility of light. Major Callan Mercer felt the weight of that decision in his lungs before he felt it in his legs. American doctrine would have recommended first light movement, air cover overhead, clear lines of sight, layered support, movement synchronized with artillery windows and predictable extraction plans. Instead, Mercer had chosen darkness so complete it felt geological. The canopy above them, 3 layers thick, turned the night into something physical, a ceiling pressing down. He raised a closed fist. The file halted without a sound. Behind him, Corporal Blue Harris adjusted the sling of his rifle by millimeters. Blue carried less ammunition than an American infantryman would have considered safe. No spare radio battery beyond mission minimum. No heavy support weapon. What they carried instead were machetes honed thin as scalpels, compact suppressed carbines, and rations cut to the gram. The weight reduction was not comfort, it was doctrine, speed over mass, autonomy over supply chain. If they were compromised, no immediate fire base would rescue them. The manual said that was reckless. Mercer believed it was freedom. The jungle smelled like wet earth and decomposing leaves, sweet rot. Somewhere distant, a night insect pulsed in a steady rhythm, a metronome against the silence of men who had trained themselves not to cough, not to clear throats, not even to swat mosquitoes. The Australians moved in staggered intervals, not on fixed spacing, but on terrain intuition. 10 meters when visibility allowed, 3 when vines thickened. American patrol doctrine would have pushed a wider front, bounding overwatch, louder security. It assumed contact was inevitable. It prepared to dominate it with firepower. Mercer's assumption was different. Contact was a failure. He had read the American field recommendations before deployment, emphasize presence, deny terrain, project dominance. The theory was clear: show force and the enemy withdraws. But in the triple canopy jungle, dominance was invisible. Firepower turned trees into splinters but revealed position like a flare. Blue paused mid-step and crouched, hand flat against the mud. Mercer saw the shift instantly. Something had changed. The air. There was smoke where there shouldn't be smoke. Not the heavy column of a campfire. Just the faintest thread of carbon, carried low. The smell reached them before the sound. Mercer inhaled once, shallow. Enemy proximity. He rotated his wrist twice, silent signal to compress formation. The patrol narrowed, bodies flowing between buttress roots and hanging vines. Boots rolled heel to toe to prevent the snap of twigs. Sweat crawled down spines and into waistbands. On the other side of a shallow ridge, 12 men from a local guerrilla unit waited in a semicircle. Their commander had studied American patterns carefully. Patrols approached on likely axes, supported by distant artillery grids. If engaged, they would fix in place, call for support, escalate. The guerrillas had dug shallow fighting positions accordingly, sightlines angled to catch a larger element. They were ready for noise. They were ready for radios erupting in urgency. They were ready for Americans. They were not ready for 6 Australians who refused to behave like a doctrine. Mercer dropped prone and eased forward, inch by inch, until the ridge lip allowed him a sliver of view. Through a lattice of roots he saw the movement cloth, the outline of a weapon barrel catching the faintest ambient glow. He counted heads, 12 confirmed, likely more in depth. American Doctrine would have recommended disengagement and reporting, or immediate suppressive fire to establish dominance. 12 versus 6 in constricted terrain did not favor patience. Mercer felt the equation differently. He studied their posture, relaxed, expectant, facing outward in a broad arc, prepared for a frontal incursion. They assumed mass. Blue slid beside him, breath so controlled it was almost mechanical. Mercer traced 2 fingers in the dirt, flank left. Blue nodded once. The Australians did not break into fire teams. They dissolved. Each man peeled into the undergrowth at oblique angles, circling wide with the kind of slow patience that made minutes feel like hours. Leeches found ankles, branches grazed cheeks. No one brushed them away. On the guerrilla side, a young sentry shifted weight, bored. He had been told to watch the obvious approach. The Americans liked trails. They liked structure. They liked predictable lanes of advance. The jungle behind him felt empty. It wasn't. Blue emerged 10 meters off the enemy's right flank, unseen, suppressor already threaded. He waited not for a command, but for geometry. Mercer had not dictated firing lines. Each operator carried that responsibility internally. When it began, it did not sound like battle. It sounded like fabric tearing. 3 suppressed shots, almost simultaneous, into the rearmost fighters. Before the sound registered as a threat, Mercer engaged the left anchor of the semicircle. Another operator neutralized the radio carrier before he could reach his handset. There was shouting, then confusion, more than coordination. The guerrilla commander spun, searching for the expected direction of assault. There was none. The Australians were already shifting again, not holding position, firing once, twice, then moving, compressing angles. Less than 40 seconds. Then silence returned. Leaves drifted down where rounds had tipped branches. The insect rhythm resumed as if nothing had occurred. Blue exhaled, slow. His hands trembled slightly, not from fear, but from the compressed violence of it. He had made 3 decisions in under 5 seconds that training manuals could not fully script. Who to shoot first, when to relocate, when not to fire at all. Mercer scanned the perimeter for secondary contact. None. 12 enemy fighters neutralized. No friendly casualties, no artillery, no air support. No radio chatter beyond a single coded burst once the patrol had displaced 200 meters. The success was tactical, but what lingered was philosophical. They had violated recommended engagement ratios, ignored prescribed support structures, operated without visible dominance, and they had prevailed precisely because they had refused to be predictable. As dawn finally pressed pale light through the canopy, Mercer composed the initial after-action notes in his head. He understood the mathematics of what they had done. 6 men defeating 12 was not extraordinary. 6 men defeated 12 who were prepared for the Americans was. Back at brigade headquarters, the report would land on desks layered with procedural certainty. American officers would note the deviation from doctrine, the absence of support assets, the risk tolerance. They would also note the outcome. Blue felt it too as they exfiltrated something beyond adrenaline, a quiet pride edged with unease. They had proven something in mud and blood that no white paper could argue, that truth has consequences. Because if 6 men could do this without the machinery of conventional doctrine, then what did that say about the machinery itself? And somewhere beyond the jungle, far from the smell of cordite and wet soil, senior officers would soon confront a problem they hadn't anticipated. The patrol had succeeded. The report would not be easy to ignore. The jungle was not the only place pressure built. By the time Major Ethan Callan stepped off the helicopter pad and into the air-conditioned operations center of the American Forward Headquarters, his boots still carried a crust of dried mud along the seams. The red earth flaked faintly onto polished linoleum floors as he walked. It felt like bringing something feral into a cathedral. Inside, the war looked different. Rows of screens glowed in chilled blue light. Digital maps layered with icons, arrows, neat geometry. Coffee cups sat beside laminated briefing binders. The air smelled faintly of disinfectant and recycled ventilation. Conversations were quiet, controlled, wrapped in acronyms. Here, contact reports were sanitized into bullet points before they were ever spoken aloud. Callan paused just inside the doorway, shoulders still carrying the memory of humidity and weight. 48 hours earlier, he had been knee-deep in swamp water, guiding a four-man patrol through mangrove shadow, listening for the click of a safety catch in the dark. Now he was about to explain why his men had ignored a joint directive. At the far end of the conference table stood Colonel David Mercer, the American liaison assigned to oversee coordination between Allied Special Operations units. Mercer was not a villain. He was a product of a system that had worked mass firepower, synchronized maneuver. He believed in doctrine, the way some men believe in gravity. You could argue about it, but it still held everything together. Major, Mercer said evenly as Callan took his seat. Your last operation deviated from the agreed engagement protocol. It was phrased as an observation. It was not. Callan folded his hands on the table. His knuckles were still nicked from a thorn brush. Yes, sir. The room fell quiet. Around them, staff officers watched without appearing to watch. The deviation had been simple on paper. American doctrine in the sector favored saturation, establish presence, clearly, visibly, assert dominance. Patrols moved in larger formations, supported by aggressive aerial overwatch. The idea was to signal control. Callan's men had done the opposite. They had slipped in under the tree canopy without requesting immediate air cover. They had bypassed a known insurgent transit route instead of blocking it. They shadowed a courier for 12 hours rather than detain him. In doing so, they had identified an entire logistics node that larger sweeps had repeatedly missed. Operationally, it was a success. Quiet. Precise. 3 arrests. No shots fired. Strategically, it was uncomfortable, because it implied that the dominant approach, visible, force-heavy, decisive, might be illuminating itself to an enemy that thrived on patience. Mercer leaned forward. When you operate outside the coordinated framework, you create gaps. Other units plan around predictability, around structure. Callan held his gaze. Sir, predictability is what they're counting on. It was not defiance in his voice. It was fatigue. The friction had been building for months. Every time the Australians returned with actionable intelligence gathered through small-footprint infiltration, it raised unspoken questions in American after-action reviews. Why were the Australians achieving comparable disruption with a quarter of the manpower? Why were their casualty rates lower? Why did villages clear after their presence instead of harden? No one wanted to ask it directly. The alliance was built on mutual respect, shared sacrifice. Publicly challenging methodology risked something larger than tactical disagreement. It risked appearing ungrateful. It risked implying superiority. And for a smaller nation embedded within a massive coalition apparatus, that was dangerous territory. In the sterile briefing room, Callan felt a different kind of exposure than he did in the jungle. There, a threat came with sound, distant movement, insects falling silent, a metallic click. Here it came with silence and careful language. Major, Mercer continued, his tone measured, there are political layers to this mission. Optics matter. Unity matters. Unity. The word lingered. Callan thought of his patrol, of Corporal Hayes crouched in the dark the night before, whispering into his throat mic as rain drummed softly on leaves. Hayes had not been thinking about optics. He had been thinking about which branch might snap under weight, which shadow moved wrong. Loyalty to the mission felt tangible in the field. Loyalty to the alliance felt abstract until it wasn't. Back at the Australian compound, word filtered down quickly. There were murmurs of pressure from higher headquarters, informal suggestions to align more visibly with coalition patterns, adjust reporting structures, increase joint patrol appearances. One evening, as Callan stood outside the barracks watching the light fade over the tree line, Captain Riley approached quietly. "They're leaning on you," Riley said. Callan nodded once. "They're leaning on Canberra too." That was the part few of the younger troopers saw. Behind the operational disagreements were diplomatic cables, interdepartmental conversations, quiet negotiations between defense ministries. Australia's contribution was respected, but it was also small in scale compared to the American footprint. Deviating too far from coalition doctrine could be interpreted as criticism. Criticism could be interpreted as disunity. Burning the manuals had tactical consequences. It also had political ones. Mercer felt the strain as well. In his private moments, he replayed the Australians' successes with reluctant admiration. He knew their methods were not reckless. They were deliberate, grounded in decades of counterinsurgency adaptation. But he also carried responsibility for synchronization across thousands of personnel. Scale demanded order. To him, the Australians were introducing variables into a machine that depended on predictability. To Callan, that machine was visible from miles away. During one joint planning session, tension finally surfaced. An American operations officer presented a large-scale sweep scheduled for dawn, multiple platoons, armored support, aerial presence. The map glowed under projector light. Callan studied it, then spoke quietly. "If we move that much steel through those villages, we'll flush them into the hills. We won't catch them, we'll educate them." The room stiffened. Mercer exhaled slowly. "What's your alternative?" "Let us go in first." Small team. Quiet. Identify movement patterns before the sweep. It was a compromise, but also a statement. For a long moment, no one spoke. The hum of the air conditioning seemed louder than artillery. This was no longer about ego, it was about trust, about whether a coalition could tolerate doctrinal asymmetry without fracturing. Eventually, Mercer nodded once. "You'll have 12 hours. It wasn't a full endorsement. It wasn't rejection. It was space. Outside, as Callan stepped back into the heavy night air, the humidity closed around him like an old friend. The jungle did not care about alliances. It did not care about political optics. It rewarded those who listened. But he understood now that every quiet success carried weight beyond the patrol debrief. Every deviation risked institutional patience. Every independent win forced a silent question inside the alliance. If this works, what does it say about us? The pressure to conform was enormous. Careers could stall quietly. Units could be sidelined diplomatically. Funding could shift. So why didn't they yield? Because in the end, the patrol in the mud did not have the luxury of abstraction. They had terrain, darkness, breath, and consequence. And somewhere above the briefing rooms and policy debates, someone in Canberra continued to shield them, absorbing political friction so that, in the jungle, the men could remain unreadable. The enemy was no longer only in the trees, it was in the architecture of power. And the next confrontation would not test marksmanship, it would test resolve. In the beginning it looked like defiance, smaller patrols, fewer radios, no heavy supporting elements grinding through the jungle with mechanized confidence. American commanders saw it as risky minimalism, an almost stubborn refusal to scale up. But inside the wire at Nui Dat, beneath canvas roofs damp with monsoon humidity, Major David Harrington understood something few outside his regiment yet grasped. It was not a rebellion, it was designed. Harrington had spent nights hunched over dog-eared manuals that traced their lineage back to the North African desert of the 1940s, to the founding principles of the British Special Air Service under David Stirling. The original doctrine had not been about mass or spectacle. It had been about disruption through invisibility, about operating inside the enemy's mental space without ever presenting a target. The Australians had inherited more than a badge. They had inherited a question. How do you fight an enemy who does not present himself? In Vietnam, that question sharpened. Sergeant Mick Doyle remembered the first time Harrington gathered them before deployment into Phuoc Thai province. The briefing was quiet, almost conversational, no theatrics. Harrington tapped a grease pencil against a map and said, "The jungle is not an obstacle, it is a partner. If you respect it, it will hide you. If you rush it, it will betray you." It sounded philosophical. It was tactical. The Americans measured dominance in battalions and fire bases. The Australians began with footsteps. Training became a laboratory. Recruits were dropped into scrubland outside Perth and told to move without leaving a sign. Indigenous trackersmen whose families had read terrain for generations were invited to critique them. A bent blade of grass, a scuffed root, a displaced pebble near a creek bed. Every mistake was evidence. Every correction is a refinement. Corporal Tom Bluey Chambers once described the humiliation of being tracked back to camp by an Aboriginal instructor who never raised his voice. "You think you're invisible," Chambers recalled, and then he kneels down, touches the dirt, and tells you where you stopped to adjust your pack. Silence was not just absence of sound, it embodied discipline. Harrington insisted patrols be capped at 5 or 6 men, small enough to disappear, large enough to fight briefly if cornered. Equipment was stripped to essentials, no spare weight that would force heavier footprints, no excess radio chatter that would ripple across frequencies. Every item had to justify itself against the question, does this increase our ability to remain unseen? The jungle itself became an instructor. Humidity clung like wet cloth. Leeches fastened silently beneath socks. The air smelled of rot and green life fermenting. Movement was measured in inches. A snapped twig could carry 50 meters in still air. A careless exhale might betray position to ears trained by years of guerrilla survival. On one patrol, Doyle lay prone for 9 consecutive hours while a Viet Cong supply column passed within 30 meters. He could hear fabric brushing against bamboo baskets, low murmured conversation in dialect, the metallic clink of rifle slings. His calves trembled, sweat pooled under his cheek, but the patrol did not move, because the doctrine said observation was victory. American units often sought contact. Contact validated presence. It justified firepower. Harrington's philosophy inverted that logic. The objective was intelligence density, not body count. Information extracted without detection was a force multiplier that artillery could never replicate. It was obedience, just not to institutional tradition. Harrington once explained it to a skeptical liaison officer who questioned the refusal to call in air support during fleeting engagements. "If we call in jets," he said, "we teach the enemy where we operate. If we vanish instead, we teach him nothing." This was not recklessness, it was calculus. The patrol debriefs became rituals of refinement. Veterans dissected their own errors with almost academic precision. Where did the wind shift? When did spacing collapse? Did the point man adjust pace to terrain gradient? Doctrine evolved incrementally, each patrol adding a line to a living manuscript written in sweat and restraint. Lieutenant Alan Price, a younger officer absorbing Harrington's framework, later described the moment he understood the system's coherence. "I realized we weren't improvising at all. Every decision, patrol size, insertion timing, engagement rules, was derived from terrain analysis and enemy behavior. It was architecture. Vietnam's dense canopy nullified aerial supremacy. Thick undergrowth swallowed mechanized advantage. The Viet Cong moved by memory and shadow. To fight them conventionally was to fight blind. So the Australians obeyed the environment instead. When American officers observed SAS patrols returning with detailed maps of enemy base areas, complete with bunker orientation and supply routes, they were often perplexed. How had 6 men gathered what companies had failed to uncover? Because 6 men had listened. Because they had treated the jungle not as hostile chaos, but as readable text. There was a quiet triumph in this realization, though it rarely surfaced as pride. It manifested instead as calm efficiency. Chambers once said the most beautiful sound in Vietnam was the absence of the synchronized breathing of a patrol moving correctly through elephant grass. No clatter, no curse, no misstep. Silence became proof of mastery, yet this coherence also exposed tension. If the system was so meticulously constructed, rooted in British Special Operations lineage, enriched by indigenous tracking knowledge, adapted rigorously to Vietnamese terrain, why did larger Allied forces not fully adopt it? Harrington understood the answer before anyone asked. Institutions are built to replicate scale. Bureaucracies reward measurable outputs, territory cleared, Enemy counted, bases established. The SAS model resisted quantification. Its victories were often invisible, its impact cumulative rather than spectacular. It demanded patience, humility, and decentralization of authority, traits difficult to graft onto massive military structures optimized for conventional war. Adopting the SAS doctrine would have required more than tactical adjustment. It would have required cultural transformation. So the Australians remained, in the eyes of some, anomalies. But in the dense green silence of Fjord 2, patterns were becoming undeniable. Patrols, survival rates, intelligence accuracy, enemy confusion in sectors where SAS operated. A different kind of success was emerging, less visible, more enduring. Harrington stood one evening at the edge of camp as monsoon clouds swallowed the last light. The jungle exhaled mist. Somewhere beyond the tree line, an enemy unit moved with its own doctrine, its own obedience to terrain. He did not see his men as rebels. He saw them as students of history, of land, of adversary. The doctrine had grown in the dark, shaped not by defiance but by listening. And as its internal logic became clear, a quieter question began to form, unsettling in its simplicity. If a small regiment could adapt so precisely by studying the ground beneath its boots, what did it say about the rest of the war that so few others did? The jungle offered the answer only in silence. The reckoning did not arrive with applause. It arrived in cardboard boxes. Decades later, the central officer, his hair thinned to gray, his shoulders slightly rounded but still squared by habit, sat at a long wooden table in a climate-controlled archive room. The air smelled faintly of paper dust and cold metal shelving. In front of him lay the weight of a war reduced to files, after-action reports, casualty logs, intelligence summaries stamped once with urgency and now with history. He ran his fingers across the edge of a folder marked in fading ink. The paper felt brittle, almost fragile. It struck him how light it was in the hand, how little mass it carried compared to the weight it represented. Numbers do not bleed, but they remember. When the Australian patrol doctrine was first implemented in Vietnam, it was viewed by some allies as reckless minimalism, 4 to 6 men, operating deep, avoiding decisive engagement, prioritizing observation over annihilation. It violated the prevailing American rhythm of the war, where battalion sweeps and heavy firepower defined success. It looked small. It looked cautious. To some, it looked timid. The record says otherwise. He opened one report slowly. The paper whispered as it unfolded. Contact initiated at 4:30 hours. Enemy strength estimated platoon-sized. Engagement duration under 3 minutes. Friendly casualties 0. Enemy casualties confirmed 5. Probable higher. Patrol exfiltrated undetected. The pattern repeated. Over the course of their Vietnam deployments, Australian SAS patrols achieved casualty ratios that defied conventional expectation by some internal tallies, as high as 10-1 in specific operational windows. More striking than the ratio was the survival rate. Patrol after patrol returned intact. Men rotated out with fatigue in their eyes but without their names etched onto memorial walls. Across the Pacific, American units courageous, heavily resourced, technologically dominant, were absorbing losses at a scale that dwarfed these small patrols. Body counts climbed into the tens of thousands. Entire brigades cycled through rotations, grinding against terrain and enemy networks that reconstituted as fast as they were struck. From the American command perspective, metrics were overwhelming. A force of hundreds of thousands generates a tidal wave of data. When you are that large, feedback diffuses. A flawed assumption can survive longer simply because it is cushioned by scale. A patrol lost here, a platoon mauled there, it becomes a percentage point, not a doctrinal indictment. Smaller forces do not have that luxury. An Australian patrol losing 2 men out of 6 is not a statistic. It is half the team. It is operational paralysis. It is a funeral in a small country where everyone seems to know someone. The officer leaned back slightly, the chair creaking beneath him. He remembered the early briefings, the raised eyebrows, the subtle dismissal from Allied counterparts who believed saturation firepower was the only language insurgency understood. He remembered standing his ground, arguing that stealth and patience were not signs of weakness but of precision. He had carried that argument in his body for years. Now the files told the story without him. Operational success rates were documented in sterile phrasing, intelligence gathered, enemy supply routes mapped, ambushes executed with minimal friendly loss. The doctrine: avoid unnecessary engagement, strike only when advantage is overwhelming, withdraw before the enemy understands what happened, had produced measurable outcomes. Yet vindication felt hollow in his hands, because the war itself was lost. From the perspective of surviving patrol veterans, the numbers offer a strange comfort. One of them, leaner now, hands rough with age spots, once described the doctrine as something you felt in your spine. "We weren't there to prove a point," he had said quietly. "We were there to come home." He remembers the humidity pressing against his lungs, the smell of damp earth and cordite, the way his heart hammered during the long hours of silent observation, insects crawling across his neck while he dared not move. The doctrine lived in that restraint, in the discipline to wait, in the refusal to fire unless the geometry of the moment was perfect. When they did fire, it was sudden and surgical. 3 minutes of violence, then silence folding back in. He still wakes sometimes at 4:30. For these men, the casualty ratios are not abstract triumph. They are evidence that the fear was justified, the caution necessary, that the theory they trusted with their lives was not an illusion. And yet, pride is inseparable from grief. They know how many did not return from other units. They saw the American columns pushing through villages under the weight of artillery and expectation. They heard the distant thunder of B-52 strikes shaking the ground miles away. They respected the courage. They questioned the method. The institutional tragedy on the American side was not a lack of bravery. It was insulation, a military so vast it could absorb losses without immediate doctrinal collapse. A command structure incentivized to produce metrics: territory cleared, enemies counted rather than survivability ratios that would have forced uncomfortable change. The record shows that smaller, adaptive doctrine preserved lives. It shows that disciplined stealth could outperform brute scale in certain environments. It shows that feedback, when painful enough, can sharpen a force rather than break it. But acknowledgement did not come in parades. For years after the war, the Australian patrol doctrine existed in a quiet corner of military scholarship. Respected internally, seldom celebrated, the officer carried the knowledge like a sealed letter. He had been right about something that cost lives to prove. What does it mean to be right in a war that ends in withdrawal? The archive room was silent except for the soft hum of climate control. He closed the folder gently, as if returning something fragile to rest. His hands bore the faint tremor of age, but they were steady enough. He understood now that the record was not about triumph over allies. It was about accountability to the men who trusted the doctrine with their survival. The numbers were not trophies. They were justice: quiet, unadorned justice for patrols that moved like shadows through hostile terrain and returned with fewer coffins than anyone expected. The doctrine survived Vietnam. That is the final line the files seem to whisper. It survived not because it was fashionable, but because it worked. The question that lingers in the silence of the archive is more unsettling. Did it change anyone beyond those who bled for it? And somewhere, in training grounds far removed from the jungles of Southeast Asia, in the way modern Australian operators still measure distance, still ration words over the radio, still treat silence as a weapon rather than an absence the answer, may already be unfolding. The most dangerous thing in any military is a manual no one has questioned. Years after Vietnam, when the humidity and rot of Phuoc Tui had faded into memory, the central officer would sometimes sit alone in his study, the ceiling fan turning slowly above him, and think about the pages he once carried in a waterproof pouch. The manual had been thick, authoritative, printed in language that left little room for doubt. It promised clarity in chaos. It offered diagrams of patrol formations, radio protocols, engagement rules crafted far from the red mud and tangled vines of the long high hills. In Vietnam, those pages had felt heavier than his rifle. He had learned slowly, painfully, that the jungle did not read doctrine. The jungle did not respect tradition. It swallowed sound, bent light, erased lines of sight, and turned certainty into vulnerability. The enemy moved differently there. The Viet Cong did not mass where expected. They dissolved, they waited, they let habit do their killing. He remembers the first time he told his patrol they would do it differently. The silence that followed was not defiance, it was fear. To step outside written instruction in a professional army is to flirt with accusation. It risks careers, reputation, and the quiet suspicion of arrogance. But he had watched too many patterns repeated, too many patrols walking into predictable geometry. Terrain over tradition. It was not a rebellion. It was obedience to something older than paper. That philosophy did not end in Vietnam. It migrated. It hardened. It became institutional memory inside the Australian SAS, not as a slogan, but as a reflex. In Somalia, under the white glare of a different sun, operators found that urban sprawl and famine-ravaged streets demanded improvisation beyond inherited templates. The dust tasted metallic. Gunfire echoed unpredictably between concrete shells. The terrain was no longer jungle, but the lesson remained. Maps are suggestions. Reality is sovereign. In East Timor, humidity returned, but the political terrain was as complex as the physical. Villages watched. Allegiances shifted with rumor. Patrol routes could not simply mirror past conflicts. The SAS adjusted quietly, shaping reconnaissance around human patterns instead of inherited assumptions. Doctrine bent again, not broken, but reinterpreted. And then Afghanistan. Mountains that tore breath from lungs, valleys that funneled movement into narrow corridors. An enemy that blended tradition with modern tools. Here, algorithmic intelligence began to hum in the background. Satellite feeds, signals intercepts, drone imagery flickering in operation centers thousands of kilometers away. Screens glowed blue in climate-controlled rooms while operators on the ground felt heat radiate from stone and dust clog their throats. The contrast was stark. In Vietnam, the officer had unfolded a paper map under a poncho while rain hammered overhead. In Afghanistan, young troopers studied digital overlays that were updated in real time. Data points bloomed across terrain models. Patterns were predicted by software trained on thousands of incidents. But when the patrol stepped off the helicopter and boots met gravel, the algorithm fell silent. The mountain still decided. The wind still distorted the sound. Shadows still concealed intent. A goat path still offered more truth than a satellite image. And when something felt wrong, when the air carried a tension no sensor could quantify, it was the operator's instinct, not the screen, that mattered. The central officer watched this evolution from a distance, older now, aware that his own generation would eventually become footnotes. He did not romanticize the past. He knew the value of technology, of coordination, of institutional structure. But he also knew how easily institutions fall in love with their newest tools, how quickly success calcifies into doctrine, how quietly curiosity can be replaced by compliance. He would sometimes take the old manual from his shelf, not to resent it, not to mock it, but to remember. The pages had not been evil, they had been written by professionals trying to impose order on uncertainty. The danger was never the existence of doctrine, it was the absence of questioning. The manual is gone now, lost in a move, perhaps, or deliberately discarded. Its absence feels symbolic, not because it was defeated, but because its purpose had been fulfilled. It had forced a confrontation between instruction and environment, between loyalty and adaptation. Inside the modern Australian SAS, young officers are taught history not as myth, not as legend, but as case study. They learn that independence is not a license, it is my responsibility. To reject received wisdom requires evidence, humility, and the willingness to carry the consequences if wrong. It demands deeper study, not less discipline. The hardest discipline in any military is not obedience, it is thought. There is quiet pride in that lineage. Not triumph, not chest-beating. Just the steady awareness that survival and sometimes moral clarity depends on the courage to adapt before the institution is ready to agree. The central officer, now a legacy rather than a rank, understands something that cannot be codified. Every generation will face its own manual. It may not be paper, it may be an algorithm, a predictive model, a doctrinal briefing slide glowing in a darkened auditorium. It will carry authority, it will promise efficiency, and somewhere a young operator will feel the terrain contradicts it. That moment, small, private, tenses where the future of any force is decided, not in parades, not in procurement budgets, but in the quiet calculation of an individual asking whether the ground beneath his boots agrees with the page in his hand. The jungle, the desert, the mountain, they do not care about tradition. They only reward attention. So the question lingers, long after Vietnam's ashes have cooled and new conflicts have taken their place, when the next manual is written. And it will be you who will have the courage to question it. And what will it cost them to be right before anyone else is ready to listen?